The sun hung like a furnace lid over Larksburg Gulch, its white heat beating down on the wooden bones of the town. The wind came in off the desert in short, hot breaths, stirring dust through the crooked alleys and whispering secrets against the flaking paint of shuttered windows. The town creaked and sighed like an old man trying to sleep through a storm, every board and hinge aching under the weight of time. Even the vultures circled slow today, too lazy to dive, their wings casting spinning shadows over the hard-packed street. Miriam Wells stood in the doorway of her little shop, sewing needle-paused mid-stitch. She watched the road, like one watches the edge of a knife, uncertain whether it would cut or simply glint in the sun. Her fingers moved with quiet precision over the linen in her lap, but her eyes remained locked to the east. Something was coming. She felt it in her bones, like a chill in the joints before a monsoon. She wore black still, though her husband had been dead these 6 years, shot by horse thieves on a fog-thick night. Miriam had not cried, not publicly, just lit the lantern the next morning, opened the shop, and never spoke his name again. But everyone in town respected her. She mended their shirts, sewed their wedding dresses, fixed the sheriff's frayed collar every spring. Her silence was not cold. It was forged, like steel tempered in fire. Across the street, the blacksmith's forge grumbled and belched smoke. Jed Thorne worked as always, bare arms blackened with soot, eyes squinting through the hammerfall. He barely spoke. No one remembered hearing more than a word or two out of him in years. Massive, broad as a barn door, with hands that could bend iron and eyes that looked through people like they were already ghosts. Some said he'd come west to escape something. Others whispered darker things, that he'd once stood on a battlefield soaked in blood, or burned a prison to the ground with men still inside. But rumors in Larksburg faded fast, and no one dared ask questions of Jed Thorne. Children watched him from behind barrels, wide-eyed and mute, as he hammered iron into shapes of quiet strength. A plowhead, a wagon wheel brace, a sledge so heavy it took 2 men to lift. He moved like the desert hills, slow, certain, impossible to shake. On this day, even his hammer seemed to strike a beat out of rhythm. Something in the air was crooked, like a song sung backwards. The saloon's piano tinkled a tired tune, the notes drifting down the street like paper boats on a dry stream. Old man Cootie sat outside the general store with a cracked jug in his lap, swatting flies and cursing the sun under his breath. A mongrel dog lay stretched in the shade beneath the sheriff's office, too lazy to bark. The town was half asleep, half waiting. The heat made the sky ripple at the edges like a dream just before waking. They came near sundown. 5 riders, kicking up a storm of dust behind them, silhouettes against the blood-orange sky. Their horses looked like they'd been rode hard and fed nothing. Their hats were pulled low, faces half-shadowed. The leader sat straight in the saddle, a man with a jaw like broken stone and eyes like river glass. His name was Coil Colt, and his brothers trailed him like snakes behind a boot heel. The Colt brothers gang. Every man, woman, and child in Larksburg had heard their name. Stagecoach robbers, bounty killers, livestock thieves, though thieves sounded too clean for what they did. They'd once strung up a marshal in Tombstone and used his badge for target practice. No town they visited ever quite healed right after. As the horses clattered into the square, shutters slammed and curtains twitched. The piano inside the saloon clunked to a halt. The sheriff stepped onto the boardwalk, fingers brushing the butt of his revolver, but stopped short when Coil Colt looked his way. Just one look. That was all it took. The sheriff turned and walked back inside. Miriam's needle paused again. She did not move, did not rise, only watched. Her mouth tightened, but her eyes remained calm. Jed Thorne stood in the doorway of his forge, the hammer still in his hand. Smoke curled from the anvil behind him. His face was unreadable, carved in shadow, but he did not look away. Not yet. Not today. The Colt brothers dismounted with slow, deliberate swagger. Their boots hit the dust like punches. The youngest, Grady, twirled a knife as he walked, flicking it in the air like he was slicing clouds. The middle one, Clay, chewed tobacco and spat at a tumbleweed that had the nerve to roll past. Coil nodded toward the saloon, and 2 of them drifted in like wolves scenting meat. Only Coil came toward Miriam. He stopped just short of her porch, glanced at her sewing, then at her. His mouth curled, not quite a smile. "Miss Wells," he drawled. "Fine evening. Hope business is well." She said nothing. "You got any extra cash sitting in that tidy shop o' yours?" he asked, voice like molasses over a razor. "See, times are hard. And me and my kin, we're off airing insurance." Her needle resumed, slowly, the stitch neat and tight. "I take that as a no," Coyle said, turning his head, voice still warm but colder somehow. "Mighty brave of you." A gust of wind swept through, scattering dust and dry leaves across the street. Somewhere, a door creaked on its hinges, but no one stepped out. No one said a word. Jed Thorne remained in his doorway, motionless. He did not blink. Coyle looked back at Miriam. She raised her eyes just once, and whatever he saw there, steel sorrow, something older than either, made his fingers twitch. He turned away, muttering something about manners, and walked back to his brothers. The gang didn't stay long, just long enough for everyone to remember the feel of fear in their throats. Then they rode out as fast as they came, dust chasing their heels like a curse. The sun dipped behind the canyons. Shadows stretched long across the street. The wind grew still. Later that night, as lanterns flickered in windows and dinner plates clinked behind closed doors, a hush settled over Larksburg Gulch, the kind of silence that felt like waiting. Something had been disturbed. The soil had been turned, and the bones underneath remembered what it meant to be angry. In the forge, Jed Thorne poured water over hot iron, steam screaming into the night. He stood alone in the glow of fire, staring down at a piece of metal shaped like nothing yet. His hands trembled once, barely, and Miriam, in her small room above the shop, folded her dress carefully over the back of a chair, smoothed the torn edge with her palm, and stared out the window long after the stars came. Saturday came with the smell of bread baking and dust rising. The market opened slow, as it always did, with the soft murmur of neighbors greeting each other and boots creaking against the wooden boards. Sunlight bounced off copper kettles and glass jars of pickled eggs. Children chased chickens between stalls. A woman laughed, not loud, but light, like the town had finally begun to forget what fear tasted like. Miriam Wells stood by her table beneath the awning she stitched herself, arranging spools of thread and lace, delicate little things for quiet lives. Her hands moved gently, every motion precise. She wore a fresh blue dress, ironed smooth, pinned at the neck with a brooch that had once belonged to her mother. She had not smiled, not really, but her face was lighter that morning. The burden had shifted, maybe not gone, but held differently. The Cole brothers arrived just before noon. 5 shadows on horseback slicing through the sun, their silhouettes long and crooked. The sound of their hooves turned heads. A hush moved through the market like a snake beneath the sand. A baby started crying. A dog barked and then whimpered under a wagon. They didn't ride fast, no need. They knew the town would part for them, like dry grass before a fire. Coyle dismounted first. His boots hit the ground with the weight of a dare. Grady and Clay followed, grinning like boys in a cruel game. The other 2, silent and mean-eyed, flanked the horses, rifles slung but ready. Coyle adjusted his hat, cracked his neck, and let his gaze wander until it found Miriam. She didn't flinch. The wind tugged at her skirt, fluttered the lace across her table. Her fingers paused for a moment over a pair of embroidered gloves, then dropped slowly to her sides. Coyle stepped forward. "Miss Wells," he said, smiling like a man about to make a toast. "Seems there's been some confusion. We made our request last week, modest little fee. Nothing unreasonable. Just a gesture o' goodwill." Miriam said nothing. Coyle's smile didn't falter, but it cooled. He glanced around. The townsfolk had gone still, some pretending to browse, others frozen mid-step. A woman with a pie tin clutched it tighter, her knuckles white. The sheriff stood beside the general store, hand resting on the butt of his revolver. He didn't move. "See," Coyle said, voice soft but carrying. "When someone says no to us, it ain't just business. It's disrespect." Still no reply. Miriam's eyes held his. Unblinking. Not brave, exactly, but steady. Unmovable. Coyle exhaled, a long theatrical sigh, and turned to his brothers. "Boys." Clay chuckled as he reached her first. grabbing the edge of her table and flipping it in a single motion. Spools clattered to the ground, thread unraveling in the dirt like veins cut open. Grady followed, yanking the awning down with a screech of tearing canvas. A gasp rippled through the crowd, sharp and fast, but no one moved. Coyle walked back toward her. "One last chance, Miss Wells." She stood like stone. The slap cracked across the square like a whip. She staggered a half step but didn't fall. Her hand rose slowly to her cheek, fingers brushing the skin where it burned. Still she didn't speak. Coyle's smile vanished. "Strip her down." Grady grinned too wide. He grabbed at her shoulder, fingers clutching fabric and flesh. Miriam struggled, turning, but Clay caught her other arm. There was a sound of ripping, of cloth tearing free, and her dress opened like a wound down the back. They shoved her to the ground. Her knees hit hard. Dust rose. The town watched. Women covered their mouths, some with hands, some with shawls. One began to cry. A man near the bakery turned away, fists clenched, but unmoving. The sheriff hadn't drawn his gun. His eyes were dull. His feet seemed nailed to the boards. No one stepped forward. Miriam knelt in the dirt, hair loose, the back of her dress hanging in rags. Her breath came hard, but she made no sound. Her face was turned downward, lips pressed tight. Her body trembled, but her spirit, somehow, did not. Jed Thorne stood in the shadows of his forge. He had not moved since the gang arrived. The glow of the fire behind him cast his outline in flickering gold. His hammer was still in his hand, its head resting gently against the ground. His eyes, barely visible beneath the brim of his soot-blackened hat, were locked on the scene across the street. His fingers tightened once on the handle, just once. Then slowly, without a word, he stepped back inside. The hammer disappeared into the dark. The forge swallowed him whole. The Cole brothers laughed. Clay stepped back, brushing dust from his vest like he'd finished a chore. Grady kicked over Miriam's overturned table for good measure. Coyle tipped his hat. "Now we're square," he said. They mounted up, turned their horses, and rode out with the same slow swagger they'd entered with, leaving the silence behind them like smoke. Miriam rose slowly, breath still uneven. She gathered the pieces of her dress around her shoulders, holding them closed with one arm. Her eyes scanned the market, not for help, not for sympathy, but for the measure of the souls who'd stood and watched. Some couldn't meet her gaze. She walked back toward her shop, barefoot now. A few coins jingled as she stepped over spilled buttons. She didn't look back. Behind her, someone finally moved, a child, perhaps 8, ran forward and began collecting her scattered spools from the dirt, cradling them in small hands. No one stopped him. Inside the forge, the fire burned hotter than usual. The sound of metal striking metal began again, slower now, deeper, like thunder echoing through a canyon, like something old and heavy being shaped into something new. The sheriff stepped into his office and shut the door, and over Larksburg Gulch, the wind began to rise. Night fell on Larksburg Gulch like a shroud, heavy and close. The usual noises faded, the clink of dishes, the piano's soft twang, even the wind, leaving only the low, rhythmic pounding of metal against metal. It came from the forge, steady and unyielding, echoing through the dirt streets like the heartbeat of something ancient waking in the dark. Jed Thorne hadn't come out after the Cole brothers left. He'd watched from the shadows, seen Miriam humiliated, her dignity torn as cruel hands shoved her into the dirt. And then, without a word, he had stepped back into the glowing mouth of his forge and pulled the heavy wooden door shut behind him. The lock slid into place with a finality that made the nearby horses whinny and stir. Inside, the air was blistering. Sparks flew like fireflies caught in a storm. Jed removed his leather apron with careful hands and wiped the soot from his brow. His eyes were calm, but somewhere behind them, something vast and smoldering had begun to move. He reached for a rusting length of rail iron tucked behind an old barrel. He hadn't touched it in years. Heavy as sin and thick as a man's wrist, it groaned when he dropped it onto the anvil. He stared at it a moment, eyes unreadable, then lit the forge higher. The bellows wheezed to life. Outside, the few still awake noticed the change. The glow behind the small, Round windows of Jed's shop burned brighter than usual, angrier even. A halo of orange fire spilled across the street, licking at the dust like a warning. The hammer began to fall again. Not quick, but heavy. Like the earth itself was being asked to remember something. Word spread by morning. The blacksmith had locked his door before sundown. He'd turned away 3 customers, a first in anyone's memory. A boy said he heard strange sounds, metal on stone, iron shrieking in protest. Old man Cootie claimed he saw smoke rising in a spiral, like a signal to the dead. Mrs. Ellery, who lived 2 doors down, told her husband in a whisper that she thought she heard someone crying inside the forge, though no one had gone in, and Jed Thorne had never once wept. No one knew much about Jed. That was the truth. They only knew what they told each other. They said he'd come from Kansas, or maybe Kentucky. They said he'd fought in the war, though which side depended on who you asked. Some claimed he'd watched a whole battalion burn to death in a barn, and he hadn't moved to help. Others whispered he'd lost a wife and child to fever and built their caskets with his bare hands, hammering through the night until his knuckles split. There was talk of a mine collapse, a revenge killing, a duel at high noon that left 3 men dead. But no one knew. He never spoke of the past. Most days, Jed Thorne was just a quiet mountain of a man, covered in soot and sweat, fixing plows and shoeing horses. He said little, charged fairly, nodded when thanked. But even then, people had sensed something sleeping beneath the surface, something that would never quite die. That something had woken. Inside, the forge roared like a beast in its den. Jed worked without rest. Sparks exploded with each blow of the hammer. His arms were black with soot, glistening with sweat, muscles taut from hours of fire and strain. He moved with purpose, not haste, each strike measured, each turn of the metal precise. He was not just making a weapon. He was birthing a reckoning. He took no food, drank only water from a bucket near the door. Now and then, he paused to run a calloused hand along the length of the metal, checking the weight, the curve, the soul of it. He had made tools all his life, bridges, hinges, nails, but this was different. This was the shape of justice, forged not from law but from rage tempered in silence. By the second night, the glow from the forge lit the street like a rising sun. Children peeked through cracks in fences. Men walked by, pretending they had somewhere to go, just to listen. The hammer never stopped. Its rhythm grew slower, deeper, more final. It was the sound of judgment being made ready. Someone said they saw him lift the half-finished thing with one hand, hold it up to the firelight, like a priest offering it to the heavens. It looked like a sledgehammer, but longer, thicker at the neck, with a squared iron head that caught the light like obsidian. Its handle was carved from old oak, wrapped tight in weathered leather. By the 3rd day, no one questioned it anymore. The town moved quieter, more carefully. The Cole brothers hadn't returned, but their shadow hadn't lifted, and now it had a shape, 6 feet tall, wrapped in soot and firelight, hammering through the night. Children dared each other to knock on the door. No one did. Miriam sat by her window each evening, watching the flicker through her curtains. She hadn't spoken to anyone since the market. Her dress was mended now, but she hadn't worn it again. She worked slowly, silently, each stitch more like a prayer than a chore. Now and then, she would pause and glance toward the forge, her face unreadable. She knew something was building, something was coming. So did the town. They began to speak of Jed differently. Not as a man, but as a thing born of heat and silence. They called him the Iron Ghost, or the Sledge. Some swore he'd made a deal with death itself, that the forge burned souls, not coal. One woman dreamed he was an angel made of smoke and iron. Another said she saw him standing under the moonlight, whispering names into the handle of the weapon. No one could say what was true, but they all agreed on one thing. Jed Thorne wasn't just a blacksmith anymore. He was waiting. The sun perched high over Larksburg Gulch, cruel and blinding. It was the kind of day that flattened everything, colors bleached, sounds muffled, hope pressed thin. The Saturday market had returned like clockwork, but it moved quieter this time. Stalls were half full. Voices murmured. Children kept close to their mothers. A single cloud hovered in the distance, but dared not cross the sun. Miriam Wells stood in front of her shop, the same spot where she had fallen to her knees 1 week ago. But she did not look broken now. She wore a white dress she had sewn herself, crisp and spotless, the threads catching the sunlight like frost on a window pane. Her hair was pinned tight. Her hands were folded in front of her, steady, unflinching. The table she had once displayed her spools on was gone. In its place stood a small wooden box, lid closed, polished and plain. No lace, no buttons, no goods. Just her, the dress, and the silence. They came just before noon. 5 again. Their laughter came first, carried on the wind like nails across a slate. The Colt brothers rode in with swagger sharpened to a blade. Their horses kicked up dust, but it was the sound of their voices that scattered people like leaves. Townsfolk turned inward, slipping behind stalls, into alleyways, behind doors. Eyes peeked from behind curtains. Doors creaked shut. Boots shuffled. No one said a word. Colt rode at the front, his long duster flapping behind him. Grady came close behind, a strip of blue cloth tied around his hatband, a remnant of Miriam's old dress, flapping like a sick trophy. Coyle spotted her and pulled up short. "Well, look at that," he said with a grin, turning in the saddle. "She's ironed herself up just for us." Clay laughed, chewing tobacco like it was a feast. Should have known she'd try to be pretty again. They dismounted as one, boots crunching against the dry earth. Coyle strolled toward Miriam with the air of a man who believed in his invincibility. Grady adjusted his hat, making sure the scrap of cloth was visible. Miriam didn't move. The white of her dress glowed against the drab tones of the street. Her face betrayed nothing, not fear, not rage. Her eyes were fixed beyond them, toward the forge. Coyle followed her gaze. The door to the blacksmith's shop creaked open. Out stepped Jed Thorne. He was bare-chested, arms dark with soot and muscle, eyes shadowed beneath the brim of his brow. His hands gripped the handle of the massive black sledge, the weapon he had forged in silence and flame. It looked too heavy for one man to carry, but he held it like a walking stick. The brothers turned. Coyle raised an eyebrow. "Well now," he said, not quite smiling. "Look who's come out to play." Jed said nothing. Grady snorted. "That the hammer you been hammering all week? We was wondering what you were making. Didn't peg you for a showman." Jed kept walking. The sun caught the edge of the sledge's head, dull iron, square and brutal, blackened like coal. The weapon was not polished. It was not pretty. It was not meant to intimidate. It was meant to end. Clay stepped forward, one hand dropping to the pistol at his side, and that was when Jed moved. The sledge arced through the air, with a sound like the sky being torn open. It hit Clay square in the chest, and the sound of it was not a crack. It was a collapse, like a barn roof caving in during a storm. Clay flew backward, feet lifting from the ground. He landed with a limp thud. Didn't rise. Everything went still. For a moment, even the wind forgot to breathe. Grady screamed and charged. He didn't reach for a weapon. He ran, fists raised, wild and fast. Jed met him with a step and a swing. Not the sledge now. That lay where it had fallen. Just his fists. One blow caught Grady in the temple, and his knees gave out. The next sent him sliding through the dirt, arms limp beside him. He didn't rise either. Coyle's face twisted, not in fear, not yet, but disbelief. The other two brothers flanked him. One drew a knife, the other a rifle. Jed walked toward them. The knife came first, slashing low. Jed caught the attacker's wrist mid-swing, twisted, and drove a fist into the man's jaw. The crack echoed. The man dropped without a sound. The rifle leveled next, too slow. Jed closed the distance, ripped the weapon from his hands, and broke it over his knee like kindling. Then came another blow, elbow to temple. Another man down. Now there was only Coyle. His hand hovered over his holster. His eyes darted from the fallen bodies to the sledge, still lying in the dust. Jed stared at him. Coyle hesitated, and then he ran. He turned and bolted for his horse, boots slipping in the sand. He didn't look back. Jed bent slowly, picked up a horseshoe from the pouch at his belt. Iron, heavy, curved like fate. He stepped forward once, took aim, and hurled it. The horseshoe spun through the air like a whisper of judgment. It struck Coyle at the base of the skull. He collapsed mid-stride, crumpling into a heap before he could reach the stirrup. Silence. Not just quiet, a full, complete stillness, as if the town itself was holding its breath. Jed stood among the wreckage of 5 men, his chest rising and falling, blood trickling from a cut near his temple. Dust clung to the sweat on his arms. He didn't speak, didn't roar, just stood, letting the silence stretch. Miriam stepped forward. She walked past the fallen, the dirt, the blood. She stopped a few feet from him. Her white dress brushed against the dust, but she didn't seem to notice. She met his eyes and nodded. Jed nodded back. Then, wordless as always, he turned and walked back toward the forge. The sledge rested on his shoulder now, not dragging. The door creaked open, then shut. The lock clicked. Smoke rose from the chimney once again. In the street, the townsfolk began to emerge, one by one, slowly, cautiously. No one spoke at first. No one moved to help the colts. The sheriff appeared, pale and breathless, but he didn't draw his weapon. He didn't say a word. Miriam returned to her shop. She lifted the small wooden box from her table, carried it inside, and shut the door behind her. The market did not resume that day, but for the first time in a long while, Larksburg Gulch felt lighter. And high above, the sun burned on, not cruel now, but clean. The wind changed first. It didn't howl or roar. It simply softened, like a weary breath let out after holding too much. Dust still rolled through the streets of Larksburg Gulch, but it didn't sting the eyes the same. The sun still burned high, but the shadows it cast felt less cruel. The town began to move again, not fast, not loud, but with the careful rhythm of something remembering how to live. The stall outside Miriam Wells's shop was rebuilt, stronger this time, with beams donated by neighbors who once walked past her with their heads low. A fresh coat of white paint covered the old bruises on the porch, and children ran up the steps without fear to deliver scraps of cloth, thread, and the occasional wildflower. Inside, the walls were hung with stitched samplers bearing short, sharp words, *mend, endure, rise, *. Miriam didn't speak much of what had happened. She didn't need to. Her presence said enough. She wore color again, muted pinks, pale lilacs. Not to forget, but to reclaim. In time, she turned the back room of her shop into a sewing school. Girls came with calloused hands and nervous eyes. She taught them how to stitch hems, reinforce seams, and, without saying it, how to build something unshakable from thread and quiet determination. The town watched her and learned. Men who had looked away during the attack began nodding and greeting again. Shame on their faces, but something else, too. A slow return of purpose. It wasn't quick, and it wasn't easy. They helped patch walls, carried firewood to her doorstep. They offered things they couldn't name, trying to say with work what they hadn't said with courage. The sheriff vanished 2 days after the fight. His office door was found open, badge left on the desk like a confession. No note, no goodbye, just absence. Some said he'd ridden east, to find a town where no one knew his name. Others thought he'd gone north, to the mines, hoping the weight of the earth might bury his failures. No one bothered to track him. Instead, the townsfolk gathered one evening in the old meeting hall. No preacher led it. No lawman presided. Just people, quiet, humble, tired of fear. They agreed to a new kind of law, one made not by threat, but by the watchful eyes of those who had seen what silence costs. They named a merchant's son as peacekeeper, a young man with no gun but plenty of questions. He'd speak softly and carry no badge, only the trust of his neighbors. It was enough. The forge burned steady again. Every morning, the clang of Jed Thorne's hammer rang through the air. He never spoke, not even after the fight. He returned to his work as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't turned 5 outlaws into broken limbs and buried silence. He fixed wagon wheels, shaped horseshoes, repaired a church bell clapper that had been cracked since Easter. Sometimes, children lingered near his door, waiting for the hammer to pause. He never waved them off, never looked up, just let them watch until they grew bored and scampered away. Now and then, he left odd gifts on porches, an iron door latch here, a finely worked nail there. His name was never mentioned, but the shape of his hands remained. The sledge never reappeared. Some said he buried it. Others believed he melted it down and scattered the metal across the town, bit by bit, into tools that would never again be used for violence. Stories spread beyond Larksburg, as stories do. A passing trader took the tale east, spun it to a barkeep in Santa Fe, who shared it with a deputy on his third whiskey. By the time it reached Dodge City, Jed had become something else entirely. A giant, a demon, a ghost in fire and iron. They called him the Iron Giant of Larksburg, and claimed he moved without sound, crushed skulls with a glance, and vanished in smoke when the work was done. No one from Larksburg corrected them. Soon after, outlaws began avoiding the pass near town. Coaches arrived unbothered. Horses drank from the trough, without gunfire in the distance. Travelers passed through without fear, and always left quieter, more respectful, as if the air itself demanded it. One day, a man rode in wearing spurs that didn't jingle and eyes that never blinked. He asked after the giant. A boy pointed toward the forge. The man rode by, slowed, stared at the heat-warped windows, then turned around and left without tying his horse. Miriam watched from her shop. She smiled, just a little, and returned to her sewing, a red thread running through the linen like a vein. Evenings came softer now. The sky stretched wide and open, painted in deep oranges and bruised purples. Lanterns flickered from windows not in fear, but in comfort. Music returned to the saloon, though it played slower, gentle, like someone remembering a song from childhood. Jed Thorne never changed. He hammered. He worked. He vanished into smoke when the day was done. People said he would leave someday, wander into the desert with only his hammer and the silence he carried. But he didn't. Not yet. And as long as the forge glowed at dawn, and the sound of justice echoed down the quiet streets, Larksburg Gulch remembered what it meant to stand. Because fire may destroy, but it also forges. And some men, once broken, become stronger than iron. He came in just past noon, the heat rising in waves off the red dirt like spirits leaving the land. A young man, barely more than a boy, hat too big for his head, boots too clean to belong. His horse was lathered and skittish, and the rifle strapped to his back had never seen dust. But his eyes were sharp, the kind that had looked through books and maps more than sights, the kind that came not for trade or shelter, but for answers. He found Jed in the same place he'd always been, behind the forge, sleeves rolled, arms blackened with soot, shaping something no one would ever see. The boy stood a long while before speaking, letting the hiss of steam and the crack of iron fill the silence between them. "I know who you are." Jed didn't look up. The hammer rose and fell. The boy stepped closer, holding out a folded, yellowed paper with edges soft from handling. A faded wanted poster, creased and brittle. The image was older, face thinner, eyes colder. A name printed in bold, Jed Thorne. Below it, the crimes, war atrocities, civilian executions, escape from federal custody after a fire consumed Fort Laramie prison. "They never found you," the boy whispered, almost reverent. "They thought you burned alive." Jed still didn't speak. He only reached behind the anvil and pulled out a freshly cooled horseshoe, still warm. He held it out. The boy hesitated. "What is this?" Jed's voice was gravel and rust, only one word. "Forge." The boy took the horseshoe. He said nothing more. He left quietly, and though he returned to his journey with more questions than he'd brought, he never again sought the truth of monsters or legends. Some fires, he came to believe, were best left to smolder beneath the ashes. That night, the forge didn't burn. No hammer sang. No smoke curled into the moonlit sky. The doors remained shut, the air too still, like breath held across the town. At dawn, Miriam noticed the silence. She walked slowly, the hem of her dress brushing along the dusty street. She stopped before the forge door, hand resting on the frame a moment, as if asking permission. Inside, everything was clean. The floor swept, coals cooled and neatly stacked, tools arranged like soldiers in parade. And in the center, laid atop the workbench wrapped in white linen, was the sledgehammer. Its head was dark iron, but polished so smooth it glinted like obsidian. The handle was sanded down to pale oak, and across it, burned deep into the grain, was her name, Miriam. She touched it gently, fingertips trembling. There was no note, No farewell. No trace of where he'd gone. Just that hammer, left behind like a crown laid at the feet of a people newly freed. Rumors spread, as they always do. Some said they saw Jed walking into the desert at midnight, barefoot and bare-chested, carrying nothing. Others swore he boarded a train east, bound for some war tribunal in disguise. One boy claimed he saw him melt into the shadows, hammer over one shoulder, swallowed by smoke like a spirit returning home. But Larksburg didn't need the truth. They had the sledge. They had the silence he left behind. And they had Miriam, who placed the hammer high above her sewing room door, not as a warning, but a promise. In time, new blacksmiths came. Travelers passed through, drawn by the legend. They spoke his name in hushed tones, fingers brushing the mark he left behind. Some came with anger, others with awe. None stayed long. The desert had a way of revealing who belonged and who didn't. The girls Miriam taught grew into women with strong hands and clear eyes. They stitched not just clothes, but banners, flags, ledgers. They sewed their names into the town's history one thread at a time. Some of them told stories to their daughters about a man who never smiled, who never spoke, but stood when no one else would. And at night, when the wind screamed across the flats, swirling dust into the air like spirits dancing, the people of Larksburg would listen. Sometimes it was just wind, but sometimes it wasn't. Sometimes it was the deep, distant pound of metal against stone, slow, steady, relentless, like a drumbeat from a forgotten war, like a warning, like justice, still echoing. And when the desert winds howl at night, some say it's the sound of Jed's hammer, still pounding justice into the bones of the earth.